Sure.
What do you think happened to the Republican Party today? Why does it feel like Seth and I, who in all intents and purposes are very personally conservative, why do we feel like we don't have a home in the Republican Party?
You don't. You don't. It's not a principled conservative opposition party. To the extent that the Republican Party ever had genuinely conservative principles, I think you can make the case that it did in one form or another until the Trump era. It abandoned all pretense under Donald Trump. So, no party is totally homogenous, including Republicans. I know we tend to get reductive, myself included, and say, Democrats are the big tent party, Republicans are not. And certainly I would argue the Democratic tent is much bigger than the Republican tent. But I think at the end of the day, there are certain aspects about the party collectively that lent itself well to a takeover by somebody like Donald Trump. So, not going to impute you all with this, but if you're conservative, more likely than not, you tend to value hierarchy and tradition and linear authority. The vulnerability there is if you're so captured by that, then if a demagogue manages to make his way up into the top of the food chain, then just by sheer reflex, decades of political tradition, perhaps cultural tradition as well, if it's also something that's just like a personal value, then it just lends itself well to, I don't particularly like this, but this person's the leader and he's the leader of the team, and the team is something that has a dynastic element to it. My father and his father before him and all these were right-wing conservatives and Republicans. I think all these things just kind of hit at once. And somebody like Donald Trump was just in a position, I don't think through any real genius. I just think he happened to be a really lucky idiot who, if he has one thing, it's just like an instinct, I think, for exploiting others. I don't think he's like some sort of grand supervillain strategist. I think he's just a guy who's grown up with privilege and wealth and the ability to recognize how to get things from others in a short-term way.
Yeah.
All these things kind of coalesce, and Trump took over the party, and there were opportunities along the way for principled conservatives to say, no, we're not going to go in this direction. The problem is that those principled conservatives
Bent the knee.
And even like people like Mitch McConnell is a good example. I don't like Mitch McConnell, but Mitch McConnell, I think, has a loyalty to something beyond himself. I don't think it's the country per se. I think at the end of the day, push comes to shove, he's shown he's loyal more to the Republican brand than the country. And I think he thought, as a lot of people did, that he could use Trump and then discard Trump when it was convenient. But what we're seeing now is a Frankenstein's monster situation where, Mitch McConnell says that he's not going to seek Senate leadership. He's going to serve out the remainder of his term. But after this election, he will no longer be the Republican leader. He's basically pulling a Nancy Pelosi. And Trump has outlasted him. It's a tragedy sort of thing where he helped create this monster, and this monster has supplanted him. So I think that's why you find yourselves in this situation, because people who were leaders and say that they were principled conservatives, at the end of the day, they put political expediency above all else. And it's killed your party. And potentially it's going to damage even more the country itself. I mean, I'll just say, throw it back to you.
Yeah.
As somebody who's not a Republican, I would probably enjoy it a bit more. And I would say with good reason, because the party brought it on itself. But it's hard for me to really delight in what's happening to the GOP, because what happens to the GOP has broader implications for the country as a whole.
Yeah. And then on the I guess the inverse of my question is, what do you think makes Democrats maybe not as susceptible to that same on the other end of it? Like, I look at a Bernie Sanders, kind of hits at the same heartstrings that a Trump figure would, and the Democrats seem to reject him in that way and then go for a Biden, or even in a unthinkable sense, they went for Hillary Clinton, who I think is the only candidate that could have lost to Trump. Why do you think that Democrats are? Is it just that their establishment is far more in alignment? Is it that their base are just smarter than Republicans right now? Why do you think maybe they're able to protect themselves from the same susceptibility? Because Trump was a Democrat for his like whole life, and then shifted to go to Republican. So obviously he saw the vulnerability there.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Liz Cheney, who is of course a lifelong conservative Republican who supported Trump 93% of the time, according to aggregate analyses of legislation. So she was a diehard Republican, a team player, and someone who backed Trump when he was president. Not only has she turned against him, she has now officially endorsed the vice president. I think that I don't know if it's the Democrats are smarter, although I don't want to talk out of my ass. I know I have seen. There are some studies out there, but I've also seen studies to the contrary, which indicate that political liberalism is correlated with higher IQ, whatever measure you put it or stock you put into that. I think first and foremost, I'm not going to sit here and say that there's no permutation of the multiverse. There's no timeline out there where the situation is not flipped. It's possible. I would say, though, if you're just asking me kind of instinctively, again, I think the values and the traditions which undergird the conservative movement just better lend themselves well to falling in line behind a demagogue, whereas the left is prone, generally speaking. Now, it's been flipped actually in the age of Trump until the past 6 months or so, I would say. We've seen a reversal of this, but generally speaking, the adage is liberals fall in love, conservatives fall in line. And I think that that's really the difference, because even like, I don't really buy into the establishment versus anti-establishment, line either, because like right now, Bernie Sanders is getting shit left, right, and center from people who probably would have taken a bullet for him 4 to 6 years ago, right?
Yeah.
You don't really see that with Trump. Like even the Bernie bros, their loyalty is much more conditional and limited than MAGA. President Obama was, love him or hate him, he's still very popular within the Democratic Party and far more popular overall. And I know if MAGA or centrists are watching, I love to point this out. Barack Obama was, is, and shall forever be more popular than Donald Trump was, is, and shall ever be. Donald Trump has never been a popular political figure. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either an idiot, a Trump cultist, or a liar. Barack Obama was an objectively popular figure, but even President Obama is somebody who is widely criticized within the Democratic Party and didn't have like the cult of personality. He's probably the closest we've had in terms of like a leading figure. But there's nothing comparable to what we see with Trump. So I think that it's just the Democratic Party's propensity towards infighting and complaining and never settling and constantly pushing the envelope, which, by the way, some people celebrate. But I will tell you, as a Democrat, it's often quite annoying. Not that I want them to settle per se, but there are times where you got to shut up and let's unite in the face of a common adversary. And typically speaking, Democrats really struggle with this. So I think it's just a combination of factors. And I think if at the end of the day you held a gun to my head and say, what is it really at the nuts and bolts of it? I just think that conservative values better lend themselves. Well, I mean, it's also not to attack religion, but also a reason why we see greater degrees of religiosity among conservatives too. To get really reductive, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, conservatives are generally more comfortable just being told what to do by a religious or political authority figure than liberals, in my estimation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Seth, do you have any questions on that to bounce off that? I've got a couple, but
yeah, I mean, I guess I was just going to ask a little bit, like, but he kind of hit on this of the infighting, because it does seem to me like had Nikki Haley stayed in, I probably would have voted her to try to beat out Trump, but then she dropped, which is super frustrating.
And then endorsed him.
Yeah, right. Anytime somebody fights against Trump even a little bit, it seems like everybody in the party, not just Trump and his followers, but also the other candidates and the other lawmakers, just jump on them as well. Where it's like, where do you go from there to bring back that good infighting, I guess?
Well, I think some of it's also fear of consequences, right? So President Biden is still the president of the United States. He is the most powerful man on earth, far more powerful than Donald Trump because he has the nuclear codes and Trump doesn't. Right. And yet there's no fear in the Democratic Party to publicly criticize the president. There is a fear of consequences that Donald Trump has instilled, and perhaps more accurately, Trump's base, not even necessarily other politicians. I mean, I'm sure that the barks of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Matt Gaetz, I'm sure that plays a role, but it's also the nameless MAGA voters who will call federal judges and threaten to kill them because Donald Trump has been indicted. That doesn't happen in the Democratic Party because there's just not that level of loyalty there. Certainly not on that frequency, I should say. So you would need politicians who would be prepared not only to lose elections, but to be prepared to put themselves and their loved ones in physical jeopardy. Mitt Romney is a great example of this. Mitt Romney, a conservative Republican who used to lead the party, not just any, this is the other thing. It's so funny how MAGA Republicans
not that long ago, Mitt Romney was the leader of the Republican Party. And he said that multiple Republican senators confided in him and congressmen that they wanted to vote to impeach Trump, but didn't, or to convict Trump of the impeachment, but didn't because they were afraid for their lives. That takes, I think, a special type of person to be willing to put their physical health and their lives and the lives of their loved ones at risk. And then, of course, there's a more cynical version, which is they don't want to lose re-election. And Trump cultists struggle in general elections because, again, Trump is not popular. And consequently, diehard Trump supporters are not popular on a national level. But the primary system incentivizes you to run as close to Trump as possible. So it's like a catch-22. They can't, Mitt Romney is probably more likely to win a general election against a Democrat in Utah than a Trump support, like a diehard Trump cultist. But Romney would lose to the cultist in the primary, right? So it's created this like mutually exclusive set of incentives. And so you would need people at the right time and the right moment to be willing to risk their lives, the lives of their loved ones in re-election, to say, for example, convict the guy when he's impeached. And instead they didn't. And so I think, quite frankly, but I'm a cynic, I think when I say you all, I mean Republicans, I think you're all stuck with Trump until he dies. Could these people be so drawn to power that if Trump loses handedly to Kamala Harris, would they be looking for a DeSantis, who is still a little bit too populist for my liking, but is not a Donald Trump when it comes to his morals? Could they get to a Nikki Haley eventually? Does power and politics play a role here?
Oh, I think they could. But again, I just don't think so as long as Trump is alive. You got to remember that Trump commands a loyalty from the Republican base that we've just not seen. I mean, here's the dangerous thing. Remember what I said, the old expression is, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. With Trump, they fell in love and in line, and that is hard to top. So here's the big one, and this is where, again, and I'll just say, if at any point you disagree, I will encourage you to speak up, because I don't expect you to. It'd be great if you did, and if you believed it, but I don't expect you all to just bash the GOP along with me. But full disclosure, again, part of my contempt for the party as an institution. Again, not every individual Republican. I've got 4 sisters, and at least 3 of them are Republicans. I don't have contempt. I love them. I take a bullet for them. But the party, the thought leaders, the political leaders, I have such contempt for it, because we see the falling in love and falling in line helix with the Trump immunity thing. Great example.
Mhm.
If you told me 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago, let's take it back to 11, because I think 10 years ago, Trump was becoming a more assertive presence in Republican politics. But 10 or 11 years ago, if you told me, hey, listen, there will come a day where the Republican Party will cheer a president demanding absolute total immunity. And not only will the Supreme Court comply, Republicans will cheer. If you told me that 10 years ago, I'd think you're out of your mind. Because if there's anything that, yes, Republicans like their tradition and their hierarchies or whatever, but they don't like total authority. They like to submit to leaders, but not be forced to submit. If you follow your preacher, it's because you choose to. Man, I'll do whatever my preacher says, but it's not because your preacher is making you. You're not making your preacher the Pope. So if somebody told me that, I would have been like, that's impossible. It's insane. It's counterintuitive to what Republicans profess to value, which is the decentralization of power. Why on earth would they centralize so much power and impunity in one person? Not even the federal government, one actor in the federal government. But here we are. You look at the polls. A majority of Americans say they don't support presidential immunity. But if you change the polling question from should presidents get absolute immunity to Trump, then it skyrockets among Republicans. That is, and this is where I wouldn't have expressed it the way he expressed some of his beliefs, but in terms of the contempt that Destiny has for that there, I share it. It is un-American. It is counterintuitive. It's dangerous. It deserves nothing but contempt and derision and should be bullied relentlessly into obsolescence. If you are a person who believes that Donald Trump, or quite frankly any president, including a Democrat, should be given absolute immunity, you should have a panic attack at the thought of expressing your opinion publicly, because you will be mocked and belittled so much. Not be in any physical danger, but because you'll be treated like that loser kid at the lunch table sitting by themselves. That's how you should feel. And I would feel that way about any Democrat says, Joe Biden should get absolute immunity. Are you out of your effing mind? No, nobody should be trusted with that level of power. Nobody.
Right.
Imagine if tan suit wearing Dijon mustard eating Barack Obama in 2013 said, well, let me be clear. I need absolute immunity. What would Fox and the Republicans have done? They'd be pulling out their pitchforks, probably their white sheets, and they would be trying to secede from the union. But because it's Trump, it's changed. No, you can't reason with that. That deserves nothing but contempt.
Yeah.
But here we are.